It's May 2007. The draft and the increased size of the AFL has led to a competition more even than it ever has been before. It led to teams from new markets and success for all of those new markets. In the last 10 years, 8 premiers have been from outside of Victoria. The AFL's plan to expand the league nationally has worked well. Maybe too well. Adrian Anderson announced that the AFL was investigating why this was the case. Well, Adrian, let me run you through exactly why each outsider team won the flag. That's assuming you've missed all of my content so far, and you probably have, Adrian, you busy man. Anyway, they are state zoning concessions, complacence from their Victorian rivals, your lot being scared of North Melbourne but being apathetic to Queensland, damn good drafting, damn good trading, and damn good drafting again. But yeah, Victorian side hasn't won the grand final for the last 3 years, so the competition must be rigged. It's not just that Carlton broke the rules and that Collingwood, Hawthorn and Essendon are all rebuilding at the same time. No, it couldn't possibly be that. So they made some changes. What those were, I'm not exactly sure, but since then only 2 flags have been won by teams not from a state named after Queen Victoria. Hang on, there's 2 of those, isn't there? This marked the start of the money era, where the league became so big it thought it could get away with anything, throwing cash at everything it thought could grow its sphere of influence, for better or, most often, for worse.
The AFL was in a whole different world compared to 10 years earlier. In 1995, clubs had a combined 261,000 members. 10 years later, that had nearly doubled. Wages had tripled during the 1990s, but this really didn't matter anymore. Oakley's landmark 1987 TV deal, combined with the AFL's national expansion, meant that just after Fitzroy had coughed up their last mouthful of blood, the TV deal was worth $18.5 million that year. Right now, in the mid-2000s, that figure is $100 million per year. Corporate partnerships were multi-million-dollar deals each, with merchandise sales hitting 9 figures. The AFL sold VFL Park for $110 million to a developer, the land ironically getting the suburbanisation that Kenneth Luke had only dreamt of only after it closed down. The year before Fitzroy went extinct, the AFL's revenue was $68 million, over 3 times what it was in 1985. Sure enough, by 2005, another 3-fold increase. If the 1980s and 90s were the age of the merger, this was the money era, the reaping of the cash that the Victorian clubs had sown or really pissed up a wall in the 70s and 80s. By 2009, football was a far different sport to what it was when the merger era died down. It was the biggest sports league in the country, bar none. With the success of Sydney, West Coast, Brisbane and the 2 Adelaide teams all fresh in the memory, it had finally become the first true national league. But the AFL wanted more. It was a big, expanding empire who hadn't really had anything blow up in their face for nearly 30 years. Everything from its westward expansion to Fitzroy's merger had gone exactly how they wanted it. So, brimming with confidence, they decided, for the first time in over a decade, to add a new team to expand again. And with teams based almost all around the country, there was one market that had been crying out for a team, who'd hosted football for decades without a team of their own, with the population and historical attendance figures to justify the expense, and with a long and storied list of footballing legends. Yep, that's right. It's the Gold Coast.
The Barassi line had already been breached. The VFL were the first to do it. The Raiders had taken Canberra, the Barassi line equivalent of a Teal Independent. What an appropriate metaphor for a Canberran team. But the westward rugby expansion had stopped there for a long time. Instead, the NSWRL focused on conquering Queensland in 1988 with a successful Brisbane team and a Gold Coast expansion team that, well, we've covered in the past and we know how that went. Then, in 1995, rugby league went ballistic in a way that no other Australian sport has before or since. The NSWRL was challenged by Rupert Murdoch's new Super League, a breakaway league that promised to do to Kerry Packer's rugby TV rights what Packer's World Series cricket had done to the ABC. Apparently suffering an overdose of his own medicine, Kerry Packer suffered an irony deficiency and tried to sue Murdoch to hell and back. The schism was a minor disagreement in comparison, mainly because that's exactly what it was. But far from breaking rugby in two, the Super League war allowed the sport to grow in places it never expected to. Along with the ARL having grown to 20 teams before the Super League war, a further 2 teams were created for the Super League itself. The Western Reds, the first professional league side to cross the Barassi line, joined the ARL in 1995 before crossing to the Super League for 1997, where they competed against a new expansion club, the Adelaide Rams. The Reds folded due to debts accumulated from paying for other teams' airfares to cross the gap all the way from New South Wales to Perth. As for the Rams, well, thanks to complications coming from the marriage of the ARL and News Limited to produce a bouncing baby 16-team NRL, the Rams were stuck in a Batman and Robin 1997-style save-one-kill-one trap where the other team was the brand-new Melbourne Storm. And yes, Adelaide is the Nicole Kidman here. The NRL made the right choice, though, as the Storm have become easily the most successful crossers of the Barassi line, even despite their obvious cheating. In fact, the Storm were the most successful Melbourne team of the 2000s in any code, and they drew a lot of Victorian media attention. So the AFL decided that they wanted to, once again, invade NRL territory and show those throw-passing Easterners how it's done. Marvel movies are terrible, Steve Irwin just died, and Justin Timberlake is the big hot thing. That's right, it's 2006, and Andrew Demetriou, CEO of the AFL at the time, is fairly easily convinced that this is a good idea, ignoring the screaming of thousands of footy-mad Tasmanians, and makes a proposal to the embattled Kangaroos. Oh, they're not really in a bad place financially or anything, they're just kind of irrelevant now. They've been linked with moves for years. They've sold home games to Sydney, then to Canberra, having changed their name from North Melbourne to appeal to specifically that market. But when Demetriou approached the Roos with a $100 million package to relocate to the Gold Coast, the Canberra pulled out of Canberra like John Howard just had. But they would only end up playing 10 home games at Carrara across 3 years, getting $400,000 per game for the privilege, and 75% of the board were actually in support of moving permanently to the Gold Coast. However, the fans obviously weren't and staged a benefit rock concert in St Kilda to raise funds for the club to stay in Melbourne. The Kangaroos asked for a 12-month grace period in response to the fan unrest to consider the decision, which the AFL refused. And so the board, with new chairman James Brayshaw, voted against moving to the Gold Coast. To add emphasis, at the end of 2007, they changed their name back to North Melbourne.
The AFL isn't really fussed. It only took them 3 weeks from that board decision to trademark the Gold Coast Football Club name, and in March all 16 clubs unilaterally agreed for the AFL to add the Gold Coast and an 18th team into the AFL. Michael Voss was earmarked as coach, but Gold Coast's refusal to give him a 5-year contract saw Guy McKenna parachuted into the role, with Voss having to settle for ruining the club he helped make great. They would rise through the league, starting from the TAC Cup in 2009 and Under-18s League, moving into the VFA, now called the VFL, in 2010, before debuting in the AFL in 2011. The 18th team was really an easy choice in terms of where to base it. There was only one market left with a rich football history, a pre-established AFL standard stadium, and a ready-made fan base for the AFL to expand into. Yep, Tasmania.
Oh man, they got rid of the Giants banner. Oh, that's what I get for filming in Big Bash season. So, when the AFL announced that the 18th team would be playing out of an old baseball stadium in Western Sydney, you could see why a lot of people were sceptical. Yes, Sydney was getting about 35,000 people to matches and had made 2 grand finals, but on average that team was still leaving about 13,000 empty seats at the SCG. There were 270% more empty seats at the SCG than at the Gabba during 2005. But the Brisbane fans showed that the main draw of the three-peat Lions was kind of the three-peat thing. In 2006, Lions crowds dropped by 15%, and when the Suns entered the AFL, they almost halved. A market that came close to selling out its stadium did this. What hope did Sydney football have? Even the Australian Senate doubted the plausibility of two Sydney teams, saying there were insurmountable cultural barriers. And, well, they were right. Wait, why are the Senate getting involved? It seemed like Tasmania was so hard done by that the Australian government felt it had to intervene. Not a good look. Rugby in both its forms had been the #1 sport on the Upper East Coast for a century. Right after universal football had failed, it took over, and Australian rules became almost a non-factor. Against the odds, the AFL had found success in the rugby heartland, but drunk on their own success, they tried to double down. And you want to know why? Well, one line from Andrew Demetrio in 2009 summed it up perfectly. Tasmanians already watch AFL. You're kidding, right? I mean, just because someone has a Pornhub subscription, that doesn't mean that they don't want a real man or woman or whatever. Tasmanians who'd been loyal to the game for a century were being rewarded for their faith by being shut out in favour of demographics that provably didn't give a good goddamn about AFL. I'll put it out there, I don't like Andrew Demetrio. Yes, the AFL thrived commercially under him, but I don't like the way he did business. I don't like the decisions he made. I don't really like how he came across to me in particular. And I don't like that he prioritised this over this. But, hey, they thought it would work. So, did it. To make sure it would, both sides were given a ludicrous amount of player recruitment concessions. They were both allowed to poach a maximum of one established player from each club, had priority access to mature age and pre-draft age talent, and a dragon's lair of high-value draft picks that helped keep Richmond and Melbourne in a sort of spiral loop of inadequacy for the next 5 to 10 years. And both expansion clubs went about their recruitment policies in different ways.
The Gold Coast were the first to stumble out onto an AFL field. Their recruitment policy was interesting. I've talked about how they used Nathan Ablett as a trail of candy leading to a box propped up with a stick to land his superstar brother. They also hired Campbell Brown, a man known for making good rational decisions on the football field, and Nathan Bock, a man known for making good rational decisions off the football field. They also hired an injury-prone forward, a ruckman who moved with the speed of an English period drama, Brisbane's best player and Brisbane's 13th best player. Now, the expansion clubs of prior years had a large amount of established players to draw from in their respective state leagues, and all did respectably well in their first season, even Fremantle, who essentially traded away Andrew McLeod, Jeff Farmer and Matthew Lloyd. The Gold Coast, though, had precious little experience on the park. Over half their lineup were making their AFL debut, and only one of those was over 20. The average Gold Coast player had scored just over one AFL goal. They were disintegrated by Carlton, and the Bulldogs, and Melbourne. Hilariously, they actually beat a Port Adelaide lineup that may well be the worst I've ever seen. Things were looking good all of a sudden. Then Essendon put 15 goals past them in one quarter. To this day, the Gold Coast haven't scored 15 goals in any one half. The week after that, they beat Brisbane, but normal service resumed from there. They finished last on percentage after Port Adelaide won by a hair against a post-Corio exorcism Melbourne. It was a terrible season.
But even that wasn't as bad as GWS's debut season. It started, well, badly. Then they beat the Gold Coast, which was fun. Then it immediately got worse in a run that ended with Hawthorn drubbing them by 162 points. Yikes. It was the start of a month-long run in which their best result was a 95-point thrashing, but that ended with a win against Port Adelaide. Again, hilarious. They finished with 2 wins and 1 win the next season. They were hopeless. So what went wrong here? Well, not a whole lot, actually. Their player poaching focused on recruiting young but established talent in the midfield and key positions. They hired a bunch of players who just retired as essentially playing coaches, and Kevin Sheedy was mentoring the mostly carefully selected youngsters they picked up. They focused on youth rather than middle-aged second-chance prospects, with an eye on success in 6 years rather than 3.
Despite the differences in policy, both clubs managed to fall into the same pitfall, kidnapping a rugby league player and dragging them, kicking and screaming, across the Barassi line as a publicity stunt. The Gold Coast Suns selected Carmichael Hunt, who, in an incident which I will make a video on at some point, kicked the winning goal against a laughably pathetic Richmond. Ah, the good times. But at least he proved himself useful and turned into not entirely a shit player. Not worth the $1 million a year that he was earning, though.
Israel Folau, though. Oh boy. He was offered $6 million over 4 seasons by the Giants, despite having never heard of the game. It showed. He was slow. He was useless in the air, he couldn't kick, he wasn't AFL fit. He could tackle, sure, but not in any great numbers. In fact, by overall value over replacement player, his debut year was one of the top 5 worst seasons since advanced stats became publicly available. He was a publicity stunt that ruined the club's reputation before they'd even played a game, and left after only 1 of his contracted 4 seasons. Technically 2, but I don't really count the first one. That was in the NEAFL, and he did even worse there, really, let's face it. This is what Tasmania and traditional AFL fans were passed up for. Good God. And of course, Demetrio thought that whole ridiculous experiment was a good idea. Fucking idiot. The good news is the rest of their players weren't utter dog shit, and they soon started winning in the manner that they and we all knew was coming given their bevy of talent. They played well, won respect, and then they did this in a grand final, lost pretty much all of that respect, and have only just recovered thanks to these biceps and the man they happen to be attached to. As for the Gold Coast, well, I've covered them. The season I'm currently filming in will be their 14th. They haven't made finals, and it's starting to look like they never will.
The Suns, as I showed in the Gold Coast Curse video, had an issue with player retention, much as the Titanic didn't have an issue with water retention. It killed them. They became an Ablett-centric lineup, unable to win without him, and in turn became a joke. After Ablett left, it seemed its sole purpose was to suck until it got moved to Tasmania. Now, that can't even happen. Their only reason to exist was so Stewie Jew could fill up his fridge, at least until they sacked him, causing him to go literally as far away from Heritage Bank Stadium as possible.
That's the on-field story. How about the attendance? Oh boy. Even now, over a decade after their first seasons, these two sides still require a significant leg up from the AFL to compensate for leaving their stadiums over half empty. In fact, despite $28 million of subsidies in 2023, the Gold Coast Suns still made a 7-figure loss. Both sides play in grounds with the equal smallest capacity of any main home ground in the AFL. Combined, they've got 20,000 people to these grounds 7 times to the end of 2023, a rate of 4%. Their averages attendance are on par, or even some cases less, than the numbers in Canberra and, you guessed it, Tasmania. These are way smaller places with no dedicated team of their own. Look, I love GWS. Look, here's the proof for it. It got Ben Hart's signature as well. That was a pretty cool moment. I never thought I would love them, but I do. They've given me some pretty damn cool experiences, and if you're in the Sydney area, I would genuinely recommend getting on board. But they and the Gold Coast Suns should never, in a rational world, have ever existed. And I'm sorry to say that, but it is true.
And while all this was happening, 2 legacy clubs were on their knees. Melbourne, the first club to ever exist in this sport, was still millions of dollars in debt. Diamond Joe's money had already worn off. They'd lost their sponsor now and lost $3.1 million in 2013 alone, with the AFL stepping in to bail them out. In addition, Carlton's salary cap breach fine ironically never got paid, as the AFL were forced to give them a loan to pay it off thanks to John Elliott's development of the already defunct Princes Park, that loan never being paid off and eventually forgiven in 2009. Brisbane, the descendants of the first VFL Grand Final winners, also made a $1.82 million loss in 2011, even after $1 million was thrown their way by the AFL, with 5-year losses mounting the 7-figure mark. This is a debt the Lions, despite making a Grand Final in 2023, are still yet to recover from.
And then we have Port Adelaide, the newest club before this twin expansion, based upon the most successful football team in this country, bar none. They'd achieved some success with their new venture in the AFL, yes, but that success abruptly ended around 2007, can't figure out why, and had mastered an unsustainable business model that saw them exit 2009 with $5.1 million worth of debt and an inability to pay their players. They were desperate enough to cover vast arrays of seats, selling the tarps that covered them as advertising space as attendances suddenly cratered. Every time their attendances dropped beneath 22,000, they made a loss on match days, which heavily contributed to $3 million losses both in 2010 and 2011. The SANFL threw money into the club that only 30 years ago had tried to secede from and destroy them, but the AFL, well, they just stood back and watched, occasionally throwing pennies into Port Adelaide's upturned hat, but saying that they wanted those pennies back one day, all while pouring money into the football equivalent of a slot machine and a money laundry. The SANFL ended up $45 million in debt, largely because of Port's funding requirements, declaring at the end of May 2011 that it had no more borrowing power left to underwrite Port's losses. The next month, the AFL was finally forced to step in, as the SANFL's debts prevented it from being able to purchase and take over the club outright, declaring a $9 million support package, eventually rising to $14 million, and that was enough to save the club. But that wasn't really the point of all of this, was it? While the AFL was preparing to pump 9 figures into its pissing contest with the NRL, teams that carried the flags of 120-year-old institutions were sinking, the AFL seemingly disinterested in saving them, particularly those outside of Victoria. This obviously upset a lot of supporters, many of whom were extremely sceptical about where the AFL was expanding to, and furious about who it was neglecting and who it was leaving behind.
And that's notwithstanding the other issues that the AFL was undergoing in recent times. The allegation of the Executive Commission becoming a boys' club, the multiple salary cap breaches of the 2000s, Ron Evans' insider trading not negating having a medal named after him, the 5-year-long Essendon supplement saga, which incidentally had Ron Evans' son at the helm, the AFL's lax policing of its drug policy almost killing Chad Fletcher, and the bizarre fight as to how that policy came about in the first place, basically everything Andrew Demetrio ever said in public or in private, Siren Gate, Michael Talia ratting out his team's tactics to his brother, Melbourne's 2009 tanking scandal, the protracted battle for Sydney's cost of living allowance, the league's profiteering from sports gambling, Eddie Maguire's multiple race relations breaches, they're all things that could have their own solo video made on them. And that's just the bad stuff that wasn't the sign of a fundamentally broken system. Of course, the AFL wouldn't want you to know much about any of those things. In fact, they've engineered the firing and exclusion of multiple high-profile media personalities for doing just that. So I guess I'm never getting an AFL media pass after this. Oops. And yes, the bad stuff hurt. A lot. But the direction the AFL was moving itself in was extremely concerning for some. The league had gotten greedy, fat, and corrupt, and had forgotten about its core markets and its reason for existing. Kind of like how we've all forgotten about that whole AFLX thing.
The expansion saga of the 2010s was more than just a failed gamble. It was a betrayal of trust, the start of a rapid decay to the relationship between the AFL and its fan base. Rampant rule changes, the introduction of meaningless competitions, perceived lowering of umpiring standards with the refusal to pay them a professional wage, the incompetently inefficient ARC and match review panel, and the prioritising of demographics that the league has never been aligned with in favour of traditional markets. And all of this was during record profits for the league. The establishment of a 19th team in Tasmania for 2028 has gone some way to repair that level of damage, but the 2010s was the first truly rocky period in a while for the AFL. It left a legacy of hurt, of confusion, of greed more than anything else, and it sure didn't help that these guys won a lot. And the AFL's overconfidence blinded it to a looming rival just outside of its jurisdiction.
Let me take you back here. The start of this video. You know who actually said that? It wasn't a philosopher. It was Hans Gruber from Die Hard, who's completely misquoting Plutarch. Alexander didn't despair at the lack of worlds to conquer. Rather the opposite, that of the unknowable infinities of worlds, he hadn't even fully conquered one. The AFL thought itself of Gruber's Alexander, when, in actuality, Australia was far from fully conquered. The battle for Sydney and Queensland still rages today with its much younger cousin in league, but the battle for the future? Well, that lay with a rival that hadn't just conquered nations, but continents.
3 years before the AFL was preparing to spaff 9 figures on moving the poorest Melbourne side to the Gold Coast, Australian soccer was on its knees. Cultural divides had split the sport down the middle. The Socceroos had great players but had tripped over their own shoelaces in World Cup qualifiers. The National Soccer League, formed in response to Australia's first and only successful foray to the World Cup so far, was hemorrhaging money, and after 27 years it had to be taken behind the woodsheds and given a couple of caps in the back of the head, partially thanks to the sports media having collectively formed an image of a boring game played by diving actors in front of violent crowds, which just wasn't true. In a huge last-ditch move, the A-League was formed. 8 basically brand new franchises with no links to the NSL powerhouses stumbled onto the spotlight with 4 hand-picked NSL holdovers in 2004. If it went wrong, which was a huge possibility, soccer was finished, forever relegated to being a niche migrant game in the most sports-mad country in the very empire that created it. After a season, it looked shaky. And then, this happened. John Aloisi's penalty, combined with the oft-forgotten heroics of the twin marks, Schwarzer and Bresciano, saved this sport in this country. The interest generated from Australians' golden generation and their amazing World Cup showing drastically increased the popularity of the round ball sport. The AFL and NRL seem to dismiss this as a passing fad. Their attendances were still well above the A-Leagues, and their shitty Gold Coast expansion teams lasted way longer than that soccer one. Even when the A-League copied the AFL's gather round concept in 2024, itself a copy of the NRL's, attendances were poor and tickets were still available to the public from the ticket boxes upon walking in, even at the main venues and the biggest drawn games. Even when the A-League decided to expand, the AFL wasn't threatened, mainly because the A-League chucked extra teams into oversaturated tentpole markets instead of winning small but critical battlegrounds, such as Tasmania and Canberra, which is becoming a bit of a theme across all sports, really. I mean, what the hell is Western United? You already had a Canberra women's team, just add external genitalia to it and they're good to go. It isn't that hard. Anyway, Sydney, soccer, yeah. But the number they didn't pay attention to until it was too late was this. Junior participation rates, particularly for women, rapidly increased, surpassing all team sports in Australia. When the W League was established in 2008, you couldn't even play women's AFL or rugby at high school levels. And guess what happened? The sister of one of the great West Coast Eagles became the face of soccer because she couldn't play the game that she loved, footy, after turning 11, and guided her Matildas to topping her group in the 2023 Women's World Cup, doing so here. Exactly 100 years after this land became a battlefield on which the last conflict of the Victorian Football War was waged, Australia beat the 3rd-ranked team in the world 4-0 in a shiny new stadium built specifically for the AFL's 2 biggest external rivals. In front of a crowd bigger than 5 AFL clubs could muster that season, the Matildas won the hearts of Australia, whilst leaving a lot less empty seats.
In 2023, the AFL announced that after years of lobbying, Tasmania would finally enter the league for 2028. On its surface, it was a fantastic move that finally brought a battling market in from the cold to join the fold, and not only that on a personal level, but a positive for the AFL in that it secured the Tasmanian market all for itself. They were the biggest league, biggest sport, on the island. But the Tasmanian Devils exposed different levels of the AFL's greed in unexpected ways. Firstly, the stadium debacle. The AFL demanded a closed-roof stadium, was adamant about it, and then just backed off once the costs got too high. The final figure, at the time of recording, stands at $750 million for a 25,000-seater, non-roofed stadium, which seems slightly excessive even in a post-COVID world, but that's not the issue. The real issue is where that $750 million is coming from. $240 million of that is coming from federal government grants, the same federal government that's just given another $200 million lump to fund Marvel's Stadium Works, the stadium that the AFL owns outright. Then the state Liberal government pledged not only $12 million per year over the next 12 years, not only $60 million for a high-performance centre, but also half the cost of the stadium build itself, $375 million. The AFL, whose revenue is $1 billion per year, who forks out $90 million out to its clubs each year, who has standing cash reserves of $160 million even after the pandemic, contributed $15 million, 2% of the total cost, and lower than the AFL's annual pissing of money into the failing Gold Coast Suns. Sure, the league committed $360 million over a decade to properly establish the club, which is about the same as the Suns and Giants combined over their first decade on paper, but adjusted for inflation is about the same figure as either one of those teams. And look what that money's doing to stabilise those two institutions. And then there's the membership thing. From 2010 to 2023, membership totals have been doubled across the league. In 2014, clubs not named GWS were making anywhere between $4 and $24 million in membership revenue, which, scaled up to 2023 without taking price hikes into consideration, adjusts to a floor of $9.29 million, or about $180 per member for the smallest team, the Bulldogs. Wait, the Bulldogs have 50,000 members? They must pack out Marvel Stadium every week, right? Well, in 2023, the Bulldogs drew just 32,700 people to their home games there on average, and here's where memberships get weird. Clubs tend to not release breakdowns of their membership tiers to the public, so let's do a breakdown ourselves. While the membership revenue for the Bulldogs has doubled, their revenue per member hasn't even outstripped the inflation rate, and is a figure that sits well below their average member seating pricing. The Bulldogs have a myriad of options, much like every other team, each with their own customisable additions and upgrades, so assuming that these options on their website were the only options they sold, I very autistically calculated this permutation of what their member figures per package look like, irrespective of upgrades, which means these numbers are an overestimation. From my estimates, and I understand these permutations can be read a variety of different ways, of the 53,082 non-AFLW Bulldog members, no more than 41% hold traditional ticketed season memberships, a figure which would account for 66% of average attendances, with a variable figure signing on for flexi memberships, which, thanks to the varying nature of attendances, don't quite fit into my calculations. Nearly a quarter have a level of membership that grants no access to matches at all. This seems about right, but goes to prove my main point that these numbers don't really mean much, giving the same value to both a full season ticket and a membership for a baby who hasn't even celebrated their first birthday, and what a way to blow $55 in a cost of living crisis. I cannot believe that's an option. In fact, to prove how bogus non-ticketed memberships can be in terms of member numbers, I plan to piss some money away on the most meaningless possible membership package, and I promise I'm going somewhere with this. Het memberships were introduced at the start of the 2010s as an extra way for existing members to throw more financial support behind teams, which became a point of contention among fans and even players. Clubs also gave away memberships for free, sometimes to sponsors to boost their numbers, while Adelaide claimed their entire emailing list were members one time. In 2016, the AFL had to define what a membership was. A member needed to have a name and contact details, contribute $50 or more, and receive a membership pack in return. In response, AFL clubs simply lifted costs of junior and baby memberships to match, so that 8-month-old baby who never attends a Bulldogs game still counts as much as someone in the cheer squad. It's a mess, And it gets worse. Clubs have separate member numbers to this definition, so although the league don't count pets in their numbers, clubs can and do. Pet membership is still something most clubs still offer, with some clubs charging more than others, with the Bulldogs posting theirs for an outrageous $55. This is a dog. Its name is Pele'ole, Hawaiian for irrelevant, and its breed does not exist as it is entirely AI generated. Good boy. And now, this fictional dog will become a member of the Gold Coast Suns to express my complete animosity and dissatisfaction with the way that member numbers are calculated. It will be interesting to see whether this completely fictional dog will count to Gold Coast member numbers at the end of the year. I'm looking forward to it. Yes, this all fits perfectly within the greed of the AFL's money era, but how does this relate to Tasmania? Well, to coincide with their official name announcement, the Devils launched a membership drive to raise funds. Memberships were a maximum of $15, and the only incentives were a sticker and your name to be displayed somewhere, speculated to be over Gate 1 of their new stadium as a foundation member. It was a bit of fun, a novelty, and within 24 hours, Tasmania had broken the all-time AFL membership record. It truly made a mockery of membership numbers, but also showed the desire for a cut-price way for fans to financially support their team. As a Crows fan, my lowest option for supporting my side is $69. Nice. Which includes $30 worth of stuff I don't particularly need or want, stuff that's basically going straight in the trash. But Tasmania, well, pledging my support for $10 is nothing off my back, and the only clutter is a sticker, which is just a nice gesture at that price. And over 170,000 people thought so too. And that really just goes to show the amount of growing dissatisfaction for some systems within the AFL. I love the game of AFL football. I genuinely think that it's the best game on the planet. But the league that's running it have lost touch with the audience that made it so successful. Corrupt executives allow drugged-up nepotists to change and distort the game, its rules, and its focus to areas that its core market really don't want it to go. During this video's production, the holding the ball rule was changed mid-season. What other sport does that? With a 20th team license to hand out, the AFL has a really important decision to make about where it wants to take the game, because it's no longer the sport that everyone plays, that everyone watches. Other markets are catching up, and the new AFL boss, if she's not really careful, may be about to get involved in a street brawl with those markets.
The AFL now has to do something it never has before. Fight a war it stands a chance of losing. Against the VFA, it had a richer base of better supported teams. Against the State League, they had a greater population base and sphere of influence. And against Rugby League, well, they simply had more money and history on their side. Now, they're outnumbered, building themselves a corner in which to get backed into. Their one saving grace to increase their base junior membership and take the fight to the global game is in an unusual place. They've made mistakes with it, boy have they, and only time will tell if it helps Aussie rules retake the crown of the biggest game in the biggest country. In fact, you might think I'm crazy for thinking that the very fate of the AFL depends on it, but AFLW really does represent the future. And I'm about to tell you how, in a few months.
Massive thank you to my patrons Cody Bibby, Temanuel Cant, Some Geek from Twitter, Gridio M, Seamus O'Dowd Clancy, and our newest member, Renegar.